Hey, it's Courtney Barriger, your host of Environmental Style Now, the A to Z podcast on all that is sustainable fashion. So, we're going to shake things up for a little bit in the new year, starting today. We're switching tracks to deliver how to's for up and coming new business owners who want to break into the eco fashion world. So, each episode will be a little different, something new, something fun for business owners to sink their teeth into. And for those of you who aren't in the biz, believe me, you will still learn a lot, and this is going to be a lot of fun. So, on this episode of ES Now, we are starting this off by meeting with Deborah King, founder and CEO of Global Measure. Deborah wants to help your eco fashion brand gain important certifications for your hard earned sustainable practices. Learn exactly what that involves in this episode dedicated to emerging eco fashion labels. Hi, I'm Courtney Barriger, and on this episode of ES Now, we have Deborah King here to tell us about her company Global Measure and how it can help your small brand become certified sustainable. Global Measure is a social enterprise that helps independent small fashion labels gain a certification in sustainable business practices from seed to upcycling. Now, we're going to find out exactly what it means to qualify. Let's jump right in.
So I actually am really, really curious. How did you get interested and started in sustainable fashion certification?
So that kind of leads off of what I just told you about growing up in the Caribbean. So my mom actually taught me to sew when I was a very small child in the Caribbean. Other kids had lots of clothes for their dolls, and my family was very practical, frugal, I would say, and that wasn't something that they wanted to spend their money on. So my mom, actually seeing that I love crafts, she taught me how to sew. So it was a hobby that I kept up. I moved to Canada as about like a preteen, and I kept up my hobby, especially as like a short, smaller person. There's not a lot of stuff that fits you perfectly off the rack. So I would always have to basically alter everything ridiculously, like to make it fit myself. So it was something that I kept on doing, kept making clothes for myself as a young adult. But math and science was kind of where my academic strengths were. So I pursued engineering, went to school for that, worked in that field for about 10 years. And throughout all that time, I was still sewing things for myself because, again, like nothing fits you perfectly. And that's true for most people of, most sizes, right? So around my 20s, though, that's when the strange phenomenon of fast fashion happened. And what I noticed was that the price of textiles, for whatever reason, became more expensive than the clothes that they were making. And if you know anything about any industry, there's a lot of people involved, there's a lot of hands that touch pieces. So it didn't make sense to me that this raw material would cost way more than, a finished product where it has like goes through multiple layers of things. So I decided to go back to school and I pursued a postgrad in sustainable fashion production. I wanted to learn more about the issues specifically associated with the fashion industry and how I could make a difference. So throughout that program, I networked with various industry professionals to kind of learn more about how I could help, what they were doing, how I could kind of bridge that gap between the awareness of the public and what their brands were doing. So that's when the idea of Global Measure came about, and just a way to help certify legit sustainable fashion organizations and to help connect the public to those brands that are authentically doing the right thing. So that's the long story of how things kind of came about.
Oh, that's so beautiful, actually. I was just thinking that actually cutting and sewing and engineering are actually
Yes.
very, very much the same. It's this beautiful crossover of art and math. So I think that's totally, totally makes sense. For my audience that may not be familiar with third-party certifications, what is it exactly and how is it important in eco fashion?
So third-party certification this is something that I talk about a lot to people. So within the world of fast fashion, you'll notice if you look at a few of their websites, you'll see that they have independently claimed a lot of things about their clothing, that they comes from various labels that they've invented, saying things have been processed in an environmentally sustainable way, and they'll use it more of like, I want to say slang terms. They're not really, there's no definitions if you want to look up on their websites about what they've defined to mean sustainable, what they've decided is an environmentally friendly fiber. There's nothing that backs up any of those claims. And that's kind of crossing into dangerous territory, because if you look at a lot of the stats out there, you'll see that consumers want to buy into environmentally friendly materials. They want to buy into this eco movement. They want to be more sustainable. They want to help the environment. And you have these fast fashion brands that are playing off of that fear. They're greenwashing by kind of like starting to use that same lingo. They're saying, okay, that's what's resonating with people. That's where I need to go. And it doesn't mean anything when they use these terms, because they're basically saying, hey, our stuff is good. We've checked it ourselves. And there's no authenticity behind that. There's nobody saying like, okay, let's see how you're producing. Let's see what materials you've used. Let's make sure that there's no modern slavery or forced labor within your supply chains. There's none of those checks that are happening. And all of that is part of being a sustainable brand. It's not just the materials used, it's the people that are involved. It's how you work within your community. It's all of those pieces. And without having that unbiased verification of what they've actually done, it's hard to tell whether these claims are actually true. So you need a third party to actually verify those claims.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I imagine also with especially larger brands, even smaller brands, you don't necessarily have every piece made in the same place. So I've actually seen before as a designer where one company will have the certification and then the other one won't. And then I end up having to say, okay, well, all of it's organic, but only some of it is Ecotex and only some of it is cleared through fair wear and some of it. So it's like, it's hard to get a full umbrella over your entire company. And that it might be, yeah, so confusing for the consumer who just wants to be able to trust that they're doing the right thing. What are some other common myths about brands that use or claim to have sustainable products?
So I guess within looking at it from a fashion brand perspective, because there's a lot of things that goes on in, I want to target specifically small brands that goes on in their minds when they think about certifications. Typically, the assumption is that it's expensive, time consuming, that it's not a space that they can play in, which is why you often don't see a lot of smaller brands with certifications attached to them. And I want to challenge that if you look for folks that are kind of specializing in that field, it becomes a little bit more affordable. So, because we're not just looking at one angle of sustainability, because that's a part of greenwashing. We want to look at the entire thing. We want to make sure that brands that are entering this space, that it's also financially sustainable for them. So them getting involved with certification bodies that may be too expensive is obviously not the way that we want them to go. We want to make sure that they're being strategic and efficient in the way that they operate and make sure that they're seeking out things that are helpful for them. So, again, like looking at things that are kind of specialized for their specific case, not necessarily something that a large brand could go after or should go after. And looking again within midst of certifications. So certifications are not something that typically lasts forever. It's not something that like, hey, we've gone through this process. We're good. We're environmentally friendly. We're all of these things. Because again, like you pointed out, things change over time. Where you're sourcing your production from, where you're even getting materials from. People in factories change as well too. Whoever's in charge, you don't know if their production practices have also changed as a result. So all of those things are factors that need to be considered. So it's not just kind of like a one and done, we were certified, we're good forever, that type of thing. And also the myth that there's like a one size fits all solution out there. You already pointed out that there's a couple of different certifications out there and all of them are equally valid. Looking at the materials, for instance, like there's a certification out there that specifically looks at the chemicals used within finishings and things like that on fabrics. That is as equally as valid as looking at something like, dealing with the farming practices around organic materials, making sure that things there are done in a particular way. And there's also one about green building standards. All of those are great certifications. So, there's not just one certification out there that people look to and say, okay, we're done. We got this one certification, because there's a number of things to consider and to look at. And that's where, as brand owners and designers and things like that, that we have to kind of help educate the public about like, hey, this is what we've done. This is how we know we're doing the right thing as well, too. So there's a lot of pieces that need to happen. And it can be confusing, but once you start getting into this world and start asking the right questions, which is tremendously important, then it becomes a little bit more clear for people to understand.
Yeah, so many angles and facets to look at. With
Yeah.
Global Measure, what are some of the, so say there's like a brand new company that wants to get certified. What would it look like to go through the process with you? And how many of these boxes do you check? Environmental, humanitarian, XYZ, and what makes you different?
Okay, so let's tackle the first question about kind of like going through the whole process. So our process, similar to some of the certifications out there, the first step that we do is it's just a generic consult with the brand, just to kind of figure out where their goals are, what they plan to do with the brand, kind of make sure that they have the bare foundation there to move forward with certification. We don't want to waste their time, and we want to make sure that they're set up for success as well too. Maybe they're just starting out and they just kind of want to get an idea of what do we need to do to prepare ourselves for certification in the future. So we want to give them all the tools necessary to, move forward. Then once, we decided that this is where we want to go with certification, we have an interview with them. We also want to visit their place of business and any facilities that they work with as well too. We also want to check their documentation as well too, is to back up any claims that they're saying. So we want to make sure that the people that they're working with, for instance, like they're getting paid a fair wage. We're looking at things like production scheduling. We want to make sure that things like, if they have certain materials that they need, that there's like an inventory management schedule attached to like a capacity plan that shows how resources have been also aligned. Because, we want to make sure we're running as sustainably as possible on all angles. After going through this whole process, we provide them back with a report with any changes that may be necessary. They get to implement any corrective actions, and then they get awarded with a certificate. So kind of getting into another one of your questions about how we give that information back to them. So we give our information back, and also how we're a little bit different. We don't just give it back in terms of like, hey, like you don't have a corrective action for this one specific area, therefore, things are not going to work out. We try to give it back in a meaningful way in terms of 6 ESG measures, so environmental, social, governance measures. And that way, it's not just from our perspective of saying like, hey, like from a social responsibility standpoint, here's some areas you need to improve. It also sets them up for success in the sense of like, hey, we want to talk to investors. These are the things that's going to be important to them. So we give them their information back in terms of 6 ESG measures. So social responsibility, health and safety, quality management, environmental performance, resource management, circular economy. And from those 6 measures, there's like, obviously like subcategories and things like that. So we're looking at things like their supply chain transparency, making sure there's no forced labor. There are things like we just talked about, the capacity planning, their waste management strategy, which is also extremely, extremely important in this, and their end of life. So what happens with their textiles at the end of that garment's life as well, too. And they have to score, I want to say about like, it works out to about 70% per each category, but within each category, there's also, mandatory criteria that if that one is not being met, we have to work on that before we can move forward with certification. So
Wow.
that's 2 of the things. Also how we're a little bit different as well too. We specifically got into this because we wanted to help small, medium, and emerging brands. Most of the certifications out there, they go after those larger brands that have a team of, people assigned to be, the sustainability professionals and things like that. We wanted to make it achievable to bring more attention to local brands, because we find with the greenwashing of these larger fast fashion brands, they have these mass marketing budgets that they can tag on all of these, greenwashing labels to small brands that are doing the right things and helping consumers find those brands. So that's why we went after that market in particular. And also, this is a bit more of a long-winded discussion, but we also have our own proprietary life cycle analysis matrix that we look at. And there's a lot of discussion we can get into around that, because I do have issues with some of the LCAs that are out there that are claiming things like you save X amount of water by buying this t-shirt or whatever the case is, because a lot of times they are not right. And yeah, so we try to do it in a way that gives brands information back about relative to other fibers. This is how you're performing. We don't put metrics out there saying like, hey, you're saving 10 liters of water, because they are not accurate. And yes, there's a lot of things I could say
It's
there.
super confusing.
Yes,
I've seen that
yes,
too on
yeah,
Reformation, even I mean, yeah, like Ralph Lauren. What do you mean by saving water? I don't understand. Against what? Against who? What are you
exactly.
measuring? What are these measurements even? Like, thanks for telling me something that has zero relevance for me
Yes.
as a consumer. It's super, super confusing.
That's
Absolutely.
exactly it. And the thing is too, so the way that these life cycle analysis metrics operate. So typically what you would do, you would look at a factory, you would try to figure out, okay, we're making this one t-shirt, how much water is being used, what's the emissions on that particular, that particular day, what transportation is involved. You look at every single piece from like your farm, from the time you farm that piece of like cotton into making into a shirt. But the thing is, to arbitrarily say if you continue to buy this one t-shirt, this is how many liters of water you're saving, is not accurate, because things change. Maybe it rained that day, maybe they didn't need to water the farm, maybe things didn't need to get transported as far for whatever reason one time, maybe we used a boat versus a plane. Like there's a lot of factors that can change. Even if it's like sunnier one day outside of the factory, you don't need to use maybe they don't need to use as much electricity to heat the place or whatever the case is. So there's a lot of nuance and variation associated with life cycle analysis metrics and numbers out there. And to your point, I mean, what are we comparing the saving of water to? Is it how you used to make your own t-shirts? Or are you trying to say that how another brand makes their shirts is how, you've compared that stat? So that's another layer of greenwashing that we don't want to get into, but we want to provide information back to our clients about, hey, if you're using recycled cotton versus, virgin cotton, this is how it can help you in your operations and things like that. So we want to provide that information back to folks rather than saying like, you'll save X amount of water, because it's just not true. Without tracing that particular shirt back in that particular day, you'll never know the exact numbers.
It sounds super methodical. How long does it take to go through a certification process?
So with us, again, it depends on the size of the brand. So if we're looking at like a brand that's producing, it's a small brand, they're producing out of their own house, it'll be a little bit quicker because we can see everything in that one spot versus like, if it's somebody that's using a production support studio within Toronto, within where I live, it'll be a little bit quicker as well too, because I can drive there, I can
Cool.
go check them out. So it totally depends on what their production processes looks like, who their supply chain partners are, and how quickly we can get those pieces lined up in terms of their availability, along with our own. So that piece really depends. But then once we're able to get all that information, it takes probably about a month to synthesize all of that information into a report that's easily digestible for brands to say, okay, this is what we need to do, or hey, everything's great. These are some areas where we can look at if we want to scale or if we want to continue to grow in this direction. So, we want to give them back information as quickly as possible so that they're able to action anything that they want to.
What about, I see so many ads, so these are ads. I don't know what online businesses are doing it, but that are using drop shipping and white label. Are those even traceable?
It really depends. I hate saying it depends. It really depends on like it could be, it really depends on the brand, who they're working with, what their ideologies are, things like that. I don't like, unless it's fast fashion, because there's a lot of things that they're not doing right. I hate bucketing all of one type of business into a certain category. So without investigating them further, without figuring out what their processes looks like, what they're trying to do, that everything involved in their singular operations, it would be hard to say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, in your experience, have you, like, okay, I'm just imagining someone starting out a brand. They say, okay, we're going to work with you. And
Yeah.
have you found that you've had an experience that has shocked the actual owner of the brand?
Um, I want to say yes and no. um, so I started out with with a few brands that were just emerging as well. And I think folks that aren't that familiar with the fashion space, they are quite shocked, getting into this line of business about just how structured it is, because it's not just the creative side, it's also the business side. So I think there's a bit of learning that happens when you just get into it as a creative and you're like, wait a minute, I need to also keep track of, like, who's making my clothes, when are they doing it, what materials I need to make sure that I'm not overbuying and I'm not causing a problem. So there was a bit of education, I would say, that have happened to some of my, just emerging brands around just like, why is it important to track that information? Because it can lead to you're overbuying and now you have created waste, right? So just some of those pieces of connecting the creative with the business side and making sure it's not just a matter of like, yeah, we're buying the best materials, right? So now we're sustainable. It's making sure we're sustainable as a whole, that we're not spending all of our money before we even have profits, before we've even figured out where our demand even is, that we know what items we need to produce, where customers even want. So I guess connecting all of those pieces and helping them understand there's a method to the madness of documenting all of this stuff. So I think that's been a little bit of a learning for some of the, the more newer brands, I would say.
Yeah, it almost sounds like, man, if I were you, I would pitch before brands even start, even like, yeah, before they even launch, because you could save them so much money on inventory. A lot of new, creative and business owners, they really don't know what's sustainable or how to track it. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
we took that feedback very seriously as well too. So we developed a checklist to help those emerging brands, whether it be to the point of like, yeah, we want to move forward with certification, or we just want to help set up our brand so that we're in a place where we can consider certification. So we came up with this checklist of 10 items to consider as you're either building your brand or looking towards certification. So we're hoping that it helps a little bit, because yeah, it is a whole new world. I mean, you're running your own business, there's a lot of new things to consider. And yeah, and people get into this wanting to do eco fashion for the right reason, they want to be sustainable, they want to showcase their own creative talent. But it's just connecting that business side to it and helping them realize, like, it's that triple bottom line. It's not just, like looking at like people on the planet, it's also profits as well too, to make sure that you're sustainable as a business, that you can continue to do what you love.
Do you do checkups, like yearly checkups or anything like that after the business has been certified? Is it sort of like is it a service that, yeah, I'm just wondering, like, when the supply chain does shift and move, and how often do you recommend these, like, yeah, how often do you recommend a checkup?
So I know this will become unsustainable in the long run, but working with a lot of these brands, they become my friends, so it's not just, it doesn't just become like I let them know, yeah, we will do checkups, about the 6 month mark and the year mark and things like that. But because, a lot of them are local to where I live, and we're in the same circles. Fashion is such a small community of people, I find. You come across the folks that you work with or have talked to throughout events, whatever the case is. So, we become friends, we check up on each other a lot, and, probably more often than necessary. But I love seeing how they're prospering, what they're investing in, what new lines that they're coming up with. So, we become friends.
That's so beautiful. What are some of your favorite brands that you've worked with?
So
Tough
so
question.
without so without I didn't want to like put any of my brands down, but there are some brands that I do love what their philosophy is and how they're approaching their markets. So there's one brand in particular, her brand's called Copious Fashions, and what she does is she takes thrifted or materials that would have gotten thrown away through the thrifting cycle. Either they were donated and they had holes in them or whatever the case is, or just not good enough to be sold. She takes them and she takes the materials apart and she creates something new from those materials. I think that's really fantastic, and it's a great way to
Wow.
keep things out of the landfill. Another one of my brands, Pom and she has a zero waste pet brand. And I love the fact that this was something that she considered from the very beginning as well, too, looking at how people would be using these materials and things like that to make sure it's, it's durable and long lasting, but also good from the pre-consumer even, phase as well, too. another brand that I absolutely love, her brand's Dottie. And what she does, she looks at I want to say the mom on the go, because when she designed her brand, it was more so looking at quality materials that were durable, that you could throw in the wash, you don't have to dry clean, and it comes back out and it's wrinkle free, so that moms like her at the time could look like they're, put together, and they can also fit in with the rest of their friends and things like that. And one last brand I want to mention. So Leonard Taylor, he's based in Winnipeg, and what he does, he takes all of his scraps and he creates these amazing artistic pieces, and he uses them to help educate kids in the neighborhood, in his local schools and things like that, about what happens with textile waste. And I think it's just a tremendous idea. He has this it's almost like more of like an art gallery, I would say, more than a fashion line, but it's really fantastic what he's doing.
Wow, every single brand that you just mentioned is completely different from the next, but it's so cool. And
Yeah.
also original. That's really, really cool.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you would want to share about Global Measure, or anything you're passionate about?
That's such a loaded question. Uh, well, I'm honestly, I love, so my passion, I've always loved working with textiles and the fashion industry in general. And if I find looking at this angle side of things is a little bit more aligned with everything I went to school with, everything that I'm like super passionate about, and just being able to tell the world about these brands that I've come across is something that I love doing. Yeah, so I love to have conversations with brands just to learn more about how they're doing, how I can best support them, because it's something that we're invested in. We want to make sure that the small, medium, emerging brands out there, they have a voice. There's a lot of changes happening in the fashion industry from a legislation perspective, especially, across the world. We're looking at Europe. They're doing things like implementing legislation like EPR. And I know it's something that we're considering in Canada as well. So I want to make sure that as these types of legislation and changes get implemented or pushed, that small brand also has a seat at that table, that they're able to make sure that, if it's a matter of like, small brands now have to consider a recycling program, that they get to be part of those conversations where we figure out, okay, what's the best way to do this, that we're not in a way making it more expensive and difficult for small brands to produce and operate, but a way that we can support them, whether it be through other government programs or whatever the case is. So I'm always interested in talking more to brands to figure out where their struggles are, where they feel they can be highlighted more, or things that they feel could be beneficial that haven't come down the pipeline yet. So yeah, so that's something I'm very interested in.
You mentioned recycling. I always find it so challenging to understand what exactly is the best thing to do at the end of life, because I know that, okay, obviously you don't throw it away, it goes in the landfill. Okay, donate it to Salvation Army or Goodwill or one of these places. It might end up in the landfill, or just, yeah, in somewhere in Africa on a beach. Like, you really don't know what ends up happening to it. So what do you recommend is the most sustainable way to discard a garment?
So that's a very loaded question, because you're absolutely right. So if we tackle that first part about what happens to a garment when we recycle it. So I know speaking with folks at Goodwill, I know that what they've done, they previously would try to sell things through through their stores, through that stream, and they would try another stream again. If that's not successful, they previously would then ship those clothes off to Africa. What they've started doing instead now is they've created a new line. It's actually called See the Worth. And what they're doing is they're actually taking those materials and turning them into something new. So they're trying to give clothing, any textiles, another life before it even gets to that consideration of the landfill. So I think that's a tremendously amazing program that they've come up with. And tackling your other question though about what people should be doing with those garments, about from a recycling perspective. So thinking about recycling, so this is something that isn't widely as talked about. There's two ways to recycle textiles. So there's the mechanical way and the chemical way. So mechanical, we shred the materials. They basically become downcycled after that. They can be used as stuffing. They can be turned into insulation for walls, whatever the case is. Upcycling would be the chemical recycling way. So that is basically breaking things back down into the constituent components where we can reweave it back into fibers. So that chemical recycling, though, becomes difficult when we're looking at blends of fibers. So if we're looking at like a synthetic mixed with like a natural material, there's currently no way that exists to separate those two fibers. It's either a matter of destroying one of the fibers in that blend, and then, you know, we're recycling now just the one stream, or basically what most places have been doing is basically, you know, trashing that. And then there's also, before we even get to that point where we're thinking about how to recycle, there's also the sorting stream. It's also there is no, in North America at least, there is no good way of sorting textiles when we get to the landfill, when we get to that, you know, the landfilling processes rather. So there's a lot of things that need to happen there. I know places in Europe, I know in France, they have like 40,000 recycling depots where people can deposit textiles. So they've thought through this a little bit more and they've allocated resources. So we can definitely learn from what they're doing. From where we're at right now, I think there's a few places that are doing good things. I want to say things like places like Salvation Army and Goodwill would probably be the best bet in terms of I guess doing that initial sort with those fibers, because they have the manpower. They're able to figure out, okay, like what looks good, what can we possibly make into something else, you know, what can we do basically from that first tier standpoint. Until we invest more resources though into the actual recycling stream for textiles, we're kind of at an impasse where we're just kind of collecting, trying to repurpose, trying to upcycle, trying to, you know, figure out different ways of using things. And then like we're kind of stuck. So we need to have more resources, more research, more government money, more things taxed to that specific chemical recycling piece in general. So yeah, very loaded topic. There's a lot of things, a lot of politics behind it, but yeah.
I know, I feel like it's a whole other interview on its own. My God, each of your categories, seriously. I think what you're doing is super important too. I mean, aside from, okay, getting the government assistance, if we can show that enough brands are willing to go through certification, that says something on its own, because I mean, the brands are willing to pay. Like, you always follow where the money is going. So if brands are willing to pay to be certified, the government should be like, oh, well, why don't we use this untapped market and put some money here, fix things? It's just,
yeah. I know within Canada in general, especially with you know, such a heavy focus on climate change and things like that. One of the programs I was involved in through the city of Toronto was something called Women for Climate. It's a global program associated with C40 cities, and what they do is they try to empower female entrepreneurs in various countries that are trying to do things to help basically slow the ongoing concern of climate change. So there are a lot of programs out there that are invested in these, you know, kind of niche programs that are tackling different areas of climate change. So I wouldn't say government is necessarily blind to this. Like, they are doing all they can, but you know, their hands are in many different pots as well. And they're kind of turning to experts like yourself, you know, like me, like other folks that are out there that are trying to do the right things and trying to empower them to bring more of a light to these issues and what people are doing. So, you know, yes, I completely agree with you about, you know, brands putting their money where their mouth is, you know, not just claiming to be eco-friendly, but, you know, going through the process and opening up, you know, their books to say, hey, we want to be transparent. We want to show people how we're different, how we're trying to make a difference. So, you know, it's all of those things combined. It's not just, you know, one person isn't going to come out of the woodwork and say, hey, we've solved climate change, we solved sustainability, you know, so it's a bunch of different things that need to happen and work together, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on my show. And how can we connect with you? I'd love to send any brands that want to get a new certification or just even begin the process to you. I want to send everyone to you.
Absolutely. So you can definitely check out my website. I'm globalmeasure.org, or my Instagram is global.measure, or you can connect with me directly on LinkedIn. I'm Deborah W. King, it's spelled DeborahWking.
A huge thank you to Deborah King. Find out more about her social enterprise on her website, www.globalmeasures.com. Well, thank you so much for listening, and that's a wrap.
Stephen here from New York City. ES Now is a Holden Core production. It is written and directed by Courtney Berger and original scored by Parker Ainsworth, with a special thank you to Alexandra Shook.